As we begin, for anybody who doesn't know me, although I see lots and lots of familiar faces, I guess everybody's curious about my story. I am Father Jeff Tunicliff. I am the pastor here at Immaculate. I became the pastor on June 26th, so it's just about 6.5 months now. And we came up with the idea of this because we were trying to think of ways to reach out to people, to draw them in to hear things. And part of what we were talking about was with all the people that come at Christmas, to be able to reach out to them that don't often come. And because my own story includes a period of time of not going to church, we decided to do this presentation. Although in doing this, I have to say, I've told parts of my story here and there, a 5-minute snippet here, a 10-minute snippet there. This is the first time I've ever done the whole thing. And I use the whole thing loosely. I'm not going to tell the whole thing tonight, or we would be here too long. We'll try and pick some highlights to share with you. I do want to start with a reading from the Bible, and I just encourage you to make sure your Bibles are used. I noticed my tape is falling off. This is the same. I bought this Bible when I was starting my philosophy and religious studies for seminary, and I've kept the same Bible through. I have other Bibles too, because this one's really going to fall apart one of these days. But this is a cheap Bible, so it has notes from all my classes written right in the margins and all that. Because it's got all those notes in it, I keep holding on to it. But always have a Bible, and I would say always have an inexpensive Bible that you're willing to write in. Do not write in the family Bible. So I'd like to begin with a reading from John's Gospel, the 20th chapter. On the first day of the week, Mary of Magdala came to the tomb early in the morning while it was still dark, and saw the stone removed from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and told them, "They have taken the Lord from the tomb, and we don't know where they put him." So Peter and the other disciple went out and came to the tomb. They both ran, but the other disciple ran faster than Peter and arrived at the tomb first. He bent down and saw the burial cloths there, but did not go in. When Simon Peter arrived after him, he went into the tomb and saw the burial cloths there, and the cloth that had covered his head, not with the burial cloth, but rolled up in a separate place. And the other disciple also went in, the one who had arrived at the tomb first, and he saw and believed. But for they did not yet understand that the scripture said he had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples returned home. I picked this passage under the idea, it says, when the other disciple looked in, he saw and believed. Peter just looked in, saw what was laying there in the tomb, where the burial cloths were. But when the other disciple looks in, it says he saw and believed. And so as I tell my story tonight, I hope to capture the ideas behind it. I could just tell a lot of facts. I hope I don't just end up telling facts. But to tell what these things mean to us. And when we think about our faith, sometimes that's just as important as the facts themselves, as the knowledge, to know what's behind that, know what it means to us. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, help us to listen with open hearts this evening, to see the presence of you in our lives, to share my story and that others may relate to it, to see how you are present for each of us. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. My story is not anything we would call a typical story of a journey to the priesthood. In years past, a typical story basically was a man entered the seminary at the latest by the time he was ready to start his freshman year of college. And many of them started in 9th grade, in high school, their seminary. They would come from strong Catholic families, cradle Catholics generally. would often have gone to a Catholic school as long as there was one in the area. I don't fit that template pretty much in any way. As far as my family goes, my dad's family, none of them are Catholic at all. And my mother's family is Catholic, but now most of them do not go to church. I do have one aunt who would love to get to church, but she's in her 70s now and has health problems that prohibits her from being able to get to church. So a weak Catholic family at best, I would say. Since my mother was Catholic, I was baptized as a little child. I remember when I was getting ready to apply for seminary, I had to get a copy of my baptismal certificate. I happened to say something to my mother, and I said, oh, I got to get a baptismal certificate. And she says, oh, you got to call St. Catherine's in Addison. I'm like, why do I have to call St. Catherine's in Addison? We lived in Horseheads at the time. We went to St. Mary Our Mother when I was born. She says, yes, but you were baptized at St. Catherine's. So that's how I found out where I was baptized. Growing up as little children, we did go to church. All I remember about my first communion is dressing up. And I think my mother used to have a picture of me wearing a white shirt and a white tie and that stuff. My parents actually divorced when I was 9 years old, which I think 100 years ago, say that probably almost would have kept you out of the seminary. But now, when I was applying to seminary, that's not a problem. You'll be dealing with lots of people that are divorced, so that will help you relate to their situations. We did go to religious ed growing up till probably must have been 11 years old or so. We were one of those families that we went to religious ed more often than we went to Mass, which I have to admit I never quite understood. It's like, if it's important enough to go to religious ed, how come it's not important enough to go to Mass? But whatever Ma said, we did. When I went to Mass, in one respect, I enjoyed it. In another, you might say, I didn't really know what was going on. And I think often as kids, that can be what it is for us. But then we started going less and less. About the time I was in 5th grade, I think. When I was in 7th or 8th grade, when I was 12 years old, Mom heard the bishop was coming around for confirmation. And the parish we were at that time was St. Catherine's in Addison. That's where we moved with our mother after the divorce. And it's a small parish, so they only had confirmation once every 4 years. So my older brother and I were confirmed at the same time, and it's kind of like, when Mom heard they were doing confirmation, oh, you got to go to the confirmation prep and get confirmed. And like many teenagers probably do, I thought to myself, if we're not going to church, what's the big deal about getting confirmed? But we did get confirmed, and that was 1981, and I didn't necessarily think much of it at that time. But later on now, if you were to come into my office, on one end, when my mother died a couple of years ago, we were taking pictures from her house. On one end of a shelf is my brother and I standing in a picture at our confirmation with Bishop Clark standing between us. He did the confirmation. On the other end of the shelf is me kneeling before Bishop Clark at my ordination when he anointed our hands. Those events were 26 years apart, but the same bishop in them. And I actually showed Bishop Clark one day, and he's like, wow, he doesn't know if he had ever confirmed that somebody, ordained someone he had confirmed. So that always sticks in my mind. But once my brother and I were confirmed, we didn't go to church again. I was 12 years old when I was confirmed, and I didn't go to church again until I was 28 years old, except for funerals. And I would say weddings, except for there didn't happen to be any family weddings at that time. So it was just my grandmother's funeral was the only time I was in church. All those years I didn't go to church. I never lived the wild lifestyle. My morals have always basically been what the church says. Didn't always understand why they were the way they were, because it didn't match people around me, but it did match what the church said. I like doing things to help people, Just didn't go to church. Some people stop going to church because of an issue. Something the church did or something was said, a specific misunderstanding. For me, like many people, it was none of that. He simply didn't go. And more than half of that reason probably was because my mother didn't go, and we lived 17 miles from the church. So as long as Mom didn't go, we weren't going, and I don't know if anybody else was around us was Catholic, or if they did, they just didn't go either, so we didn't know. But in times of loss, or those tough times, I would pray some in that, but no regular prayer. Went through high school, finished high school in Addison. Went to college, and I went to college. For those of you who don't know, I have an engineering degree. And when I went to college to study engineering, it was not exactly a deep decision. The decision to go to college for engineering basically boiled down to, I liked math, I liked science, and my favorite science was chemistry. And I've always lived in the southern tier, and I ended up going to Alfred University to study ceramic engineering, because I thought, oh, that will work out great, to get out of college and go to work for Corning. Well, that doesn't always work out the way you figured. I spent 4 years at Alfred, got the engineering degree. Through all this time, not going to church, because I wasn't going before, I remember in my third year of college, my roommate said something about going to Mass on Ash Wednesday. He was Catholic, but didn't go to church much, except for when he was home with his parents, then he went every Sunday. And he said, go to church. I'm like, where are you going to go to church? In Alfred. For those of you who don't know, Alfred is small town America. If there's 2 colleges there, if you wipe out the 2 colleges, there would be no town. There are some stores there, but if the colleges left, the stores would go bankrupt. And he said, oh yeah, the church is just down on this side street. I didn't even know there was a Catholic church in town. I did not go with him. But he did go. I got out of college thinking, okay, get a job. This will be easy. I got my college degree. I graduated with like a 3.1 average, I think. I'll be all set to find a job. A year later, still hadn't found, or just about a year later, I finally found a job. It was just a temporary job at Corning Incorporated. But I figured, okay, got the foot in the door. Be all set. The plan's finally going to happen the way I got it figured out. After I worked there about 6 months as a temporary employee, they eliminated a department of 40 engineers down the hall. So I knew what that meant for having the foot in the door. 2 months later, I was gone, because any permanent job they had, they just shuffled all the people from the department they made it. So I'm kind of thinking, oh man, here I am now unemployed after having worked for a few months. So I ended up going back just to start making some money. I went to the State Department of Transportation. That during college I'd work summers there doing construction inspection just to make some money. So I went back to work for them in a summer position. Still looking, still sending. I sent resumes all over the country. I really wanted to stay here because all my family at that time was still in the area. But I sent resumes all over the country. I said, you got to get a job, find experience. But that never worked out, and ended up getting in permanent with the state. Although I was working at a lower pay grade than my college degree would have worked. But my college degree was ceramic engineering, and the work with the Department of Transportation is civil engineering. So I couldn't just jump the steps. I could have taken a few classes and got my engineer's license. And actually there were people who I worked with, they're like, why don't you get your license? And I'm like, because I don't want to do the job that I see the guys with their license. With the state, almost everyone who had their engineer license basically became a department manager. And I didn't want to do that. I like being out on the construction projects and that. So I said, no, I don't want to do that. And they're like, you got to think about this. It would have been like a $15,000 pay raise to me. I said, I don't want that job. But as time went on, I bought my own house. I lived alone, and basically, I almost literally went to work, went to home, went to work, home, work, home. Didn't have a social life to speak of. Did spend some time with family. But for a while, I liked that. I liked living alone. I liked having my own house. Just me and the dog. I entered seminary when I was 31 years old, and I never dated for two reasons. One, I was too chicken to ask any girl out. And two, because all I did was go to work and home, never met anybody to ask out. But for a few years, I was quite content with that. And I say that was life, going to work, going home. Then I started realizing, okay, something's missing in life. At the same time, the job was becoming a little less fulfilling, a little more stressful. The supervisor I had, when I worked on construction, I had a different supervisor every year, depending on what project I was on. And that particular year, the supervisor and I had a difference of opinion. He thought he knew everything, and I pretty much could prove he was incompetent. Just a small difference of opinion. But I think that started me thinking, is this what I want to keep doing? Is something missing in my life? When I started thinking about something missing, I thought about the social life, or dating, or getting married. And none of that seemed to be what I was looking for as I thought about it. Kept thinking, and one of the things I'd done in high school a fair amount of was volunteering, helping people. So I started thinking, okay, is there something I could volunteer for? And at that time I happened to see some commercial or an ad or something that literacy volunteers, and when I bought my house, I lived in Montour Falls. The literacy volunteers was in Watkins Glen. And I thought, well, English wasn't my favorite subject in school, but when you're talking literacy volunteers, you're talking people, excuse me, the couple of people I tried tutoring some were adult males older than I am, and they were on a 3rd grade reading level, so you don't have to have that high. So I said, I'll give it a try. And I wasn't sure it was what I wanted, but it would give me a chance to volunteer. So I go to the office for literacy volunteers, and in hindsight, I think it was God's prompting to. The literacy volunteer thing did not work out. I did not end up enjoying that particular volunteering. But the part that makes me say, I think this is part of God's plan. At that time, the literacy volunteer office was in the parish center for the Catholic Church, St. Mary's of the Lake in Watkins Glen. So as I'm walking across the parking lot, I'm like, this is kind of odd. I'm supposed to be Catholic. I should be going to church here. And I don't. I'm coming here for this literacy volunteer thing. So that kind of made me wonder a little bit. And then basically in that same time frame, through channel surfing, I started seeing some of the Mass from St. Mary's of the Lake on TV. There's a parishioner who, as far as I know, to this day continues. He videotapes the Mass, and then they have a public access channel there where people can put stuff on for free. So then he goes down and plays on the Mass. So I started catching it, and as I caught it, and it was pure chance that I caught it channel surfing. Pure chance, it seemed at that point. Now, God's providence. And I said this, when I started seeing it, I said, this isn't what I remember church being like, in 2 ways. First, it didn't look right. Something looked odd. But that kind of actually intrigued me, because then I'm trying to think, well, is it the Catholic Church or isn't it? Well, later what I found out is they were in the midst of a renovation in the church, and they were having Mass in the gym. So that's why it didn't look right. But that had intrigued me, actually helped me to watch a little bit more. The other part of not being what I remember is that actually, particularly thinking the homily, interested me. The one I can't remember the priest when I was little in St. Mary Our Mother. I do remember the one that was at St. Catherine's, and just never necessarily found him interesting to listen to. I just didn't relate to him. Remember, I was 10, 11, 12 years old at that point. And in his defense, I will say, not too long after that, he filled in my home parish as a retired priest, said Mass, gave a wonderful homily. So I think it was just a priest that didn't relate to the children. Perfectly nice man. I've talked to a few times since I've been ordained in that. But when I started watching the Mass, I started saying, maybe there's something here. This is better than what I remembered. And it started channel surfing, catching some other religious programming. And then on January 1st, I decided I needed to try going back to church. This is January 1st, 1998. I just stress the day, January 1st, because everybody knows what January 1st is, right? And I'm not talking New Year's. It's the Solemnity Mary, Mother of God, which at that point I had no clue that it was the Solemnity Mary, Mother of God. I didn't know we had holy days at that point. But that was and it was, I would guess, a Thursday or a Friday. Said, okay, I'm going to go to church this weekend. And I went that Sunday, and it was more interesting what I remember. I sat in the fourth pew from the back, where everybody, all the Catholics sit in back, right? They, on the left, and just kind of played the follow the leader thing. You know, watch what the people in front of me did the same thing. That week I actually got so inspired, which given my quiet personality kind of even shocked me. I called the pastor and actually met with him and talked about things a little bit. And he's like, well, you know, you can do this, and if you want to get involved or different things, but we're glad to have you here. But, you know, say half-hour conversation or so. Well, after probably 5 or 6 weeks of going, I decided I should go to confession. As I said, I never lived the wild lifestyle. But if you haven't gone to confession in 16 years, even if you think you've done pretty good, it can be a little intimidating to go. Especially since I hadn't gone since I was 12 years old, so everything about confession was the little kid idea of confession. But I decided, okay, it's time to go to confession. I went to the Saturday night confession. Thank goodness there wasn't a line. Not because I had that much to say. When I went, there was a retired Franciscan that helped with the Masses, and he happened to be hearing confessions that night, that afternoon. And when I told him, I hadn't been to church in 15 or 16 years, he said, oh, that's okay, we'll help you through it. And then I told him about the part of deciding to come back to church on January 1st. Well, that's when I found out that it was the feast Mary, Mother of God. This priest, if you've ever been to Mass in Watkins Glen, was Father Austin, who actually died 3 years ago.
No,
I
do you know him?
believe. And he is as devoted to Mary as anyone I've ever seen. So he immediately explained to me how it was Mary's providence that I came back to church on January 1st. Or, well, I didn't come back. I made the decision to come back on January 1st. The confession took 40 minutes. Or excuse me, his talking took 40 minutes. I think I was probably done in 5 myself. But it was fine. He just made it totally comfortable, non-threatening, just totally happy. I had come back to church and kept talking about Mary too. And that always sticks in my mind about confession. And with the Mary connection, I will say, in the years since then, remember the church I was at was St. Mary's of the Lake. My first summer assignment while in seminary in a parish was St. Mary's, Auburn. My pastoral year, we take a full year off from seminary and work in a parish. I was at Church of the Assumption in Fairport. In my deacon summer, I was back there. My first assignment after being ordained a priest was St. Mary's on the south side of Elmira. And then my second assignment as a priest was Our Lady of the Lakes in Penn Yan, and Our Lady in that is Mary. And they also had part of that group of churches was St. Mary's in Rushville, which is now closed. And now I come to Immaculate Conception. I think there's probably a message about Mary in there. A few times. But to go back to where I was, come back to church, and I went from not going at all to going every week, just like that. From the Sunday I went back, after that, there was only 2 Sundays I ever missed Mass. And one I was sick, and the other was like just a couple months after I had gone back, and I had a vacation plan, and I had no idea how you would find a church someplace else. Which if you travel now, it's masstimes.org. You go on vacation, you can find a church in most places. Although somebody recently told me they were on vacation, they couldn't find a Catholic church. And they said they were in a small town in Utah. I said, well, that might explain why you can't find a Catholic church in Utah. They said there was lots of churches, but they were all Mormon churches. But started going, like I say, every week. Kept sitting in back. After about 6 months or so, started feeling like, okay, this isn't everything. There's a little bit something more. I had mentioned when I started catching the Mass on TV, they were doing a renovation. Well, the last part of the renovation they were just finishing up then was they were fixing up the old convent apartment, and they had done a gut job on it. So while they were doing the work, they had rented an apartment for the sister to live in, and it was time to move her back in the apartment. And almost nobody knew me in the parish, but the one thing they did know is I had a truck. And for those of you who have a truck, you know how many people know you have a truck. They'll call you. But I went, helped move, and that's when I started interacting with more people. Then the parish did a weekend retreat, kind of a mission, but not a mission. It was a small event. And then I started volunteering in the parish. And when I started volunteering, they're like, well, what would you want to do? You want to be a lector at Sunday Mass, or you want to do this at Sunday Mass? I'm like, no, I do not want to get up in front of people. They said, okay. So I started helping with counting the collection. As on a humorous note, when I started counting, I worked with a couple existing counters to get trained on it, so to speak. And then the secretary found a new partner for me. And I always went to the early Mass. And she called me and she said, I have a partner for you to work with now. And she says, you go to the early Mass, right? And I says, yes. And she says, well, he goes to the same Mass. You've probably seen him. She says, he's got white hair and wears glasses. At that Mass, I explained to her, I says, the only ones you've eliminated by saying he has white hair and glasses is the women and myself. But I did do that, and then I started getting involved in, at that point, what was called pastoral planning for the new millennium, which lead into what we call here now the Regional Covenanting Council. And that was when I really started finding out about a lot of different things the parish did. And still some dissatisfaction with my job, although I was no longer working with the bad supervisor at that point. But I would come home from work unhappy, and I'd go to a meeting at church and leave the meeting happy. And I figure when you can leave a meeting happier than when you got there, it probably tells you something. Because I do a lot of meetings, but I would love to be able to do things without meetings. But meetings are necessary. Meetings can be very productive. But I took that to mean something to me. But the more I got involved, the more I wanted to be involved. I think just this last weekend, for those who don't know, I have my own website, renewaloffaith.org, and I also have a blog on that website. And just this past weekend, from a parish council discussion we had last week about what makes a good parish, one of the things we talked about was feeling at home. And I wrote on my blog about that, the importance of feeling, not like just like a guest in church, but feeling at home. And the person responded, who I've actually met, who lives in the Ithaca area, but is not Catholic. And she talked about some of the same thing, her experience of when you get involved, you feel more at home. Not that we're all going to be tremendously involved. Something to connect to the parish is important. So I kept getting more and more involved in the parish, and didn't know where this was going. I just, okay, I'm just involved. I'm a single guy who doesn't go out and date and all that. I got all this time. I like being at church. And at that, as through all these months of returning to church, the pastor of the church was having eyesight problems. And he called me one night about some committee I was on. I don't even know which one it was because it doesn't matter. And we were talking about the committee work. And he said, by the way, I just found out in about a month, I'm going to have another eye surgery because the repair jobs, the previous surgeries they had done, still hadn't worked. And then he said at the same time, the sister in the parish had just found out she had a tumor. And they knew it was sizable, but they didn't know they had to do all the tests to figure out what it was it even cancerous and that. So after I got off the phone, I was praying about it, and I think God was listening, because as part of that prayer, I said to God, I said, God, if you just take care of Father Dave and Sister Kate, I'll do whatever you ask of me. Probably shouldn't have worded it quite that way. Within a few moments of that, and I really mean within just moments of that, I have what I consider my first conscious call to the priesthood, to which my reaction was, you got to be kidding me. I've already mentioned how I didn't want to do anything being in front of people, and here I am. I didn't want to have anything to do with funerals, and as the more credible excuse, I said, coming from the weak Catholic family, I didn't know enough to become a priest. But the thoughts persisted. And they would be there from time to time, but I just, this is daydreaming or something. Well, after, I have to lean on the pulpit at this point, because this is where I get chills. I don't cry, but I will get some chills. The pastor was away for his eye surgery, and we had the priest filling in, and I had no idea who the priest was. And as he was speaking, he introduced himself as the vocation director for the diocese. And that term means he's in charge of all the seminarians, all the men interested in studying for the priesthood in the diocese. So I thought to myself, maybe I'm supposed to talk to him. So after Mass, I looked for him. He was talking to somebody else. So I'm kind of like, oh, good, he's talking to somebody else, and I left. Well, it wasn't coincidence, I guess. The next morning, literally Monday morning, I go into work, and we had these pieces of we would circulate correspondence around the office so people would know what was going on. And I got to my desk, and there's a pile sitting on my desk, so I looked through it, saw it was there, and went to take it to another person for their turn to see it. And this other person, I will say, was also Catholic, but we went to different churches because we lived in different towns. But we both knew he was very involved in his church, and he knew I was involved in mine. So I went over and handed him the packet, and good morning, how you doing? And he says back to me, good morning. What's this I hear you're leaving the state to become a priest? I just stood there. I don't know how long. I know it wasn't too awful long because the clock hands didn't move that much. And finally I just said to him, I says, who have you been talking to? he says, no one. He says, I have a dream last night. And he says, I put no credence in dreams normally, but he says, I know you're involved in church, so I think I ought to mention to you. He says, in my dream, you were quitting your job with the state to become a priest. My response was, okay, I'm going back to my desk now. Later that same day, the man who sat next to me says to me, can we talk? I'm like, our desks are right next to each other. We talk all the time. He says, well, I just want to say something to you. And he says, you don't have to answer. He says, I'm going to make the suggestion, and you just go back to your work. And he says, I think you ought to think about becoming a priest. And I'm like, okay, I will. And went back to work. So within a week, I did have the opportunity. Then I said to my pastor, I says, I'm having these, well, I didn't start with I'm having these thoughts about being priesthood. I started by saying, you know, Father John was here and filled in for Mass. Then the next day, this is what happened. I told him about the guy with a dream and the other guy. And he's just sitting there the whole time, just, and then I finished, and he's like, so what do you think? I don't know what to think. One thing I want to say is if the two men at work hadn't spoke up, I may never have become a priest. So, side note, if you see somebody you think would make a good priest, say something to them. Don't say it in a way that you're going to scare the daylights out of them. But say something, because it may make the difference. And now we're going to move more into the priesthood stuff, but if there's people thinking about what church means to me, everything I say about my discernment for the priesthood, I think can apply to any major decision we make in our lives. It's just priesthood for me, because that's where God has called me. But I believe God is calling each of us in some way, and we'll use things like this, maybe not quite as obvious as the way He first made it clear He wanted me to be a priest. But God gives us little things here and there, and we have to be attuned to them. So sharing our stories about them is important to help one another find out what God is doing for us. So I continue to think about it. The pastor's like, well, if you want to talk to the vocation director, I'll be happy to get in touch with him. I said, oh, that's a ways down the line. Remember, I've only been back to church at this point 15 months. So I was still very much more. I said, at the very least, I got to have more time to learn more about the church and all this. Well, 2 months later, I was meeting with the vocation director and talking with my pastor. Like, well, we got to figure this out. I'm not going to be able to do this. And actually, his eyesight problems ended up actually helping me with my discernment, because his eyesight was bad enough, like he couldn't drive himself anywhere. So like a couple times we would go to funeral homes for calling hours. I would drive him, so I would see what was going on. So at that point, still had the heebie-jeebies in the funeral home. But I figured out I wasn't going to pass out anyway. And God working in different ways. One of the things, because of the public speaking issue, the pastor suggested, well, you probably should become a lector to see how you do with that. Because if you can't just read words out of a book, you're not going to get up there and speak yourself. So I signed up to be trained to be a lector. Went to a Holy Day Mass, and for those who are not familiar, St. Mary's in Watkins Glen shares the priest. It's one community with St. Benedict's in Odessa. And for there was a Holy Day. I think it must have been Ascension Thursday. I went to St. Benedict's for Mass, same priest there. And before Mass, he said to me, so how do you feel about baptism under fire? I said, what are you talking about? And he says, there's no lector. And he says, I know you haven't been trained yet, but I will tell you what to do if you're willing to do this. I'm like, yeah, okay. Got up, went out, he told me what to do, we're processed in, and he does the opening stuff. I go up to the ambo, and you're hearing kind of my church voice right now. I've always known I had a big voice, but I never used it. And as soon as I started to speak, the big voice was there without me even making it be there. And as I'm reading, not that I couldn't have read perfectly fine without God's help, but as I'm standing there reading, I literally felt like a person was standing right behind me, like their hand on my shoulder. But nobody was there. So to me, that was God saying, no, this is what I want you to do. I don't know how many of us have direct experiences like that, but I think, it's all God saying, this, I'm going to get you through this. Of course, he also kept me humble. When we came to the prayers of the faithful, there was a couple names they included names of sick people at that time on their prayers of the faithful. And their names were names I had no idea how to pronounce. Not quite as bad as some of those Old Testament names, but not far from it. So after about a year after I first started thinking about priesthood, I made the decision that I was going to quit my job and go to work and go to seminary. And I'm still thinking, this is nuts. I don't know why I'm willing to do this. I lit 2 months after that, because just waiting to start seminary with the school schedule. I made the decision in April, but it was August before I actually quit the job, just for when the new semester would start. April, I made the decision. The diocese said okay. In June, I wrote my letter of resignation to give them plenty of lead time. I'm writing my letter of resignation, and I'm still thinking, I don't know why I'm doing this. Made a weekend retreat at Mount Savior Monastery, and kept thinking, why? And the answer God gave me was, why not? Well, what do you mean, why not? I've already told you why not. Public speaking, da-da-da, and it's like, wait a minute. God's gotten me through all that. So I did it. Did 2 years of philosophy studies. To go to major seminary, you have to have a bachelor's degree, and the engineering degree counted for that, even though the engineering degree has nothing to do with church. But then you also have to have, they've increased it now. At that time it was 8 classes in philosophy and 4 in religious studies. So I spent 2 years doing that and found I really enjoyed the philosophy, which was a good thing because as an engineer, I wasn't sure I was going to like the philosophy. But the first year was tough in some ways. I liked the classes, but going back to living in the house with other people was a little bit of a challenge. And that second year was much better. And God continued to give me experiences to say, don't worry, I'm here. For instance, between my first and second year in seminary, I worked at a Boy Scout camp as an all-faith chaplain for the summer. That fall, after that, the director of vocations happened to be a member. At that time, I assume it still exists, there was a Catholic committee on scouting in the diocese, and he served on that. And they were going to have a retreat for some Catholic scout leaders. He was going to be away. So he asked me, since I had worked at the Boy Scout camp, if I was willing to go. He said, oh, they just want somebody to say some prayers. I'm like, well, when is it? And this is like Wednesday. He says, it's Saturday. And I'm like, okay. So then, like, Friday, they called me because they had a space problem, so they had to change the location. They called me to say, okay, the location is such and such a church. And, oh, by the way, your talk will be, just be prepared to give your talk probably near the end of the day. And talk? Oh, yeah, we just want you to give a little talk on doing services at scouting events. 15 minutes or something. Okay. I had done just that, so I can do that. But the next morning, they called me about something. He says, oh, I was looking at the book. It says saying something about the Liturgy of the Hours. So I said, okay, I know something about Liturgy of the Hours. I pray the Liturgy of the Hours. So I took my Liturgy of the Hours stuff with me. Got there, and the leader that was there was a different one that I'd been talking to on the phone. And first, he says, oh, you must be Jeff Tunicliff. your talk is from 3 o'clock to 4:30. I'm like, huh? Huh? And here's the binder with the outline of the things they would figure, because it was a set. It wasn't just a thing they were doing here. It's a national thing that was set up. So I started looking through it, and unfortunately, all day long there was other sessions of this going on, where they were talking more the scouting things versus the Catholic thing. And they were all taking questions as they went along. This is good. So when I started, I says, please ask questions. Otherwise, we won't be here for an hour and a half. And we took the hour and a half. They asked great questions, and they asked questions I knew the answer to. So to me, again, that was God saying, I'm with you. Moved ahead to seminary. In seminary, I got involved in the Social Justice Committee. From there, I started learning about the social teaching of the church, and started writing stuff on my own website. At that point, I had a website which was one of these things just did to play around on. Didn't have anything of any significance on it. But then I started writing the social teaching stuff on it. And where am I? Oh, here I am. And then to working through seminary. One of the things I remember in seminary that I think applies to all of us when we think about things we can do. Sometimes we say, this is what I'm good at. For me, I was an engineer. This is what I'm good at. How in the world could I possibly use my background in engineering to help the school? By the way, we have building repairs to do here. But thinking that way, when I was in seminary, by the third year, I got tired of hearing from my formation advisor in seminary, who was a priest, and our director of seminarians from diocese. At times they'd say, Jeff, you're thinking like an engineer. You have to stop thinking like an engineer. And finally, I told them, I can't stop thinking like an engineer. Engineering did not brainwash me. This is the way I think. I have to figure out how to make the way I think work for priesthood. But I think that's true for all of us. God calls us to do whatever He asks of us, knowing who we are. Also knowing what we can become, but because of skills we have, things we're good at. And everybody contributes to making the world a better place. And I say this in no way to degrade anybody, but if we didn't have janitors, we would have a lot more diseases because things wouldn't be clean. We need business people to keep track of finances, and that all of it is important. We just do our jobs to our best of the ability, and we can help make the world a better place, help it become what God means it to be. So went on to get ordained. I think in a homily here this summer I actually talked about when I was at my first Mass, I remember saying my Mass for the first time, thinking, God, I believe in the real presence. The Eucharist, the bread and wine we receive, is the body and blood. But it would be a big help if the first time I say Mass, if not every time, that I could be especially aware that something's going on. And when I said Mass that first time, when I said the Eucharistic prayer, the words of consecration, I knew without a shadow of doubt, yes, God was doing something. I was saying a bunch of words. God was making the transubstantiation happen. The bread and the wine coming into changing into the body and blood of Jesus. And I still feel that every Mass isn't the same feeling, but that feeling is there. I remember the first time I got called to anoint a person. In Elmira, the priests take turns being on call for the hospitals. I went on call my first week there on Thursday at noon. At 12:30, I got called. When the person was dying, I was trying to get the family. I didn't know if the person, I knew it was serious, but didn't know if the person was dying. I'm trying to get the family to tell me how serious it is so I know which set of prayers I'm supposed to use, and almost boggled it up. But God provided. Started doing things like anointing a lot. a few months after I was ordained, I got the hospital called and they said, this is the Arnott ICU. We have a patient who's actively dying. What does actively dying mean? But I didn't ask. I knew this meant they were probably dying. So I says, I'll be right there. I walk in the ICU. I still don't know who I'm there to see. The person at the desk just points that way. And I start to go around the corner and the person points that way. And I'm like, wait a minute, I need to know the person's name before I go in. And the nurse came out of the room as I was going in, so she told me. She said, but she's not going to die soon. Better get in there and say the prayers. The woman literally died as I was anointing her hands. We anoint the forehead and then the hands. I finish anointing her hands and the family turns to me and says she's gone. And I'm like, what do you mean she's gone? Didn't say that. Then the alarms start going off on all the monitors and all that, and the nurse comes in and just shuts them off because they were letting her go. At that point, knew it was her time. Then we stood there and had a couple minutes of silence, which I have the impression the family thought it was very reverent. For me, it was thinking, in seminary they said if you get there and they're still alive, you do this. If you get there and they're already dead, you do this. Nobody said anything about what you do if they die while you're doing it. But then after a couple minutes, I ad-libbed some prayers, and then we talked for a while. Family thought it was wonderful. God provided. While I was in Elmira, I revamped my website. Through seminary, I put more social teaching stuff on it. I also put a lot of papers I wrote in seminary on it. While I was in Elmira, stepped that up, started the blog I have now. And all that is particularly because of not going to church for so many years myself. I do not condone anybody not going to church. I always say if I knew then what I knew now, I would never not have gone to church. But to be able to reach out to those people, I says, I got to be putting this stuff on the internet and that's why I do a lot of that, although I know there are parishioners reading it. I know for a fact there's a non-Catholic that reads it all the time. So served 3 years in Elmira, and then after that, as a planned move, after 3 years, your first assignment as a priest is 3 years, then they move you, went to Our Lady of the Lakes, and then started thinking after 2 years, or after a year and a half there, started having conversations with the diocese. Are you ready to be a pastor? My response was, how do you know you're ready to do something you haven't done before? But did a lot of think about it. At the point when I came here, I'd been ordained for 5 years, served in 2 different parishes with 4 different pastors. Apparently I wear out pastors. But when I was in Elmira, after 2 years, the pastor's 12 years was up. So he moved on, a new pastor came. Then I went to Penn Yan. Pastor was there 10 years, so there was 11 years. So he didn't have to move that year, but a good opportunity arose. The bishop asked him to move, so he moved. So then a new priest came. So I said, well, and I thought about different things. And so when I knew Immaculate was opening, I started thinking, okay, this is a possibility. What are the questions I should ask? And I started thinking about questions like, are the people conservative? Are they liberal? Are they friendly? Are they crabby? We do have crabby people in the church, if you've never noticed. But the technical questions, how big is the parish? Oh, it's got a school. How big is the school? But I decided, based on all my past experiences, that I wasn't going to ask all those questions. I mean, the diocese puts together a packet, and the parish council is actually involved in, a priest did come and see you guys, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. The parish council gets asked questions, the staff gets asked questions, they put that together. So I did look at that stuff. But I said, the questions I want to ask, is this where God wants me to be? And I was not sure. And one way felt very great about it, but in another it's like, wow, it's a good-sized church, it's got the school, 2 cemeteries, and yes, we do have 2 cemeteries. One has no money and no burials. If you want to make any donations, we're open to that. But just thinking, could this be too much for the first time being a pastor? Not that there's anything wrong with the parish, obviously I'm here now, but just is it too much for the first time being a pastor? So I kind of hemmed and hawed. I actually got a phone call from the diocese. There's a board that advises the bishop on that. And the priest that runs the board is actually the priest where I serve my pastoral year. He calls me up and he's like, "You are thinking about applying to Immaculate, aren't you?" So I did end up applying. And then the bishop makes, the board makes, the priests get to apply, the board makes a recommendation. Ultimately, it's the bishop decision. And then Bishop Clark has always had a practice. He called the priest himself. This process was like 2.5 months. At the end of 2.5 months, Bishop Clark calls me and says to me, he says, "Well, the board's recommending I appoint you as pastor of Immaculate Conception. I think that's a very good idea, so I'd like to do that if you're still willing." And I says, "Yes, I've been thinking about it a lot, praying about it a lot, and I think it's what God wants." And he says, "Okay, that's what we'll do." The phone call took an hour, or took 1 minute and 20-some seconds after 2.5 months of thinking about it. So it's kind of anticlimactic. So I ended up coming. The first weekend I was here, the very first Mass I said was a Wednesday morning, 7 a.m. Mass. I got here at 6:15 to walk through things in my head. With Mass at 7 a.m., I got here at 6:15, and there was 5 people here already. Wow, these are really holy people. Of course, now there's just 2 of them that beat me to Mass now. Kerm, and I think, did I see John Perko come in here someplace? He was one of them, and then there was 3 others, which I don't remember. Were you one of them, John? And then there's actually a guy who was here who's a seminarian for another diocese. And so as soon as I walk in, I'm wearing my collar. They all come over. "Are you the new priest? Oh, so welcome to be here." So that was a great arrival. The first night I stayed here, the choir happened to be having a picnic, which my first night here was the last thing I wanted to do necessarily, to go to pick up. Nothing with the choir, who should be upstairs practicing right now. I just, you're moving boxes, and that last thing you want to do is go. But I said, I don't know what I'm going to do for food if I don't. So I went to the picnic, and one of our choir members, just a couple months before, had been at a burial service I had done for a family member of theirs in Penn Yan, where I had served before coming here. So she comes, you probably don't remember me, but you did my funeral. I don't know. That weekend, I met various people that were new faces to me, but I knew family members. There's one parishioner I know, their brother-in-law in Odessa. There's another person I met that I know their brother in Watkins and their mother in Elmira. A person who's on our school board came, it actually goes to St. Catherine's, but came to Mass that weekend here to check me out. And was telling me, "Oh, I'm from Elmira." So I said, "Oh, is so-and-so your dad?" Knew her. Found out I knew there's another parishioner here that I know his sister from Elmira, and he was at when I made a Cursillo weekend. He was on it. So just all these things saying, this is going to work out. You don't know these people, but it's one big church. And that's a big thing for me with a view of church. We are not, there's a lot of Protestant independent churches that are they're kind of all by themselves. To me, one of the great gifts of the Catholic Church is we are part of something bigger. Oh, and as I think about things we discovered that first week about connections, I mentioned I was confirmed when I was 12 years old. That was in 1981. And I don't know how we figured it out, but the first week here, talking with Sister Edna, found out she was at that confirmation. Because one of the kids that I was confirmed with went to the Catholic school she was working at the time. So, but just all these connections just kind of said, okay, God's taking care of this. God's got a plan. As an engineer, I like to fix everything, and I am also not a patient person normally. But for the 6 months I've been here, I keep collecting information. We are dealing with some things already, other things I just get, okay, I got to be patient. God's going to tell us what to do. Having lots of discussions with staff and parish council. This night came about from the evangelization team and all that, but just trusting God. I'm learning to better delegate because I have too much work to do. So sometimes when I get some things, I open up mail and I look at this and I say, oh good, I can give this to Mark or I can give this to Rich. I don't have to do it myself. I think the last thing I'd like to say, and I'll take questions. When I first returned to church, I was very much on fire. I don't feel that way every day. I have to admit, I wasn't feeling that way 2 hours ago. I am feeling kind of on fire right now, so thank you for letting me do this. But there's days when it doesn't feel so good. Why do we bother to come to church? Why do we have to listen to the boring priest speak? Of course, nobody says that here now. Oh, good, you're still awake. But it's okay. It doesn't have to feel incredible every time. I think when we kind of wonder about, why do I keep going to church for? It doesn't seem to do anything. Or, if we come to church once in a while, well, it just doesn't seem. I think of Mother Teresa that a couple years ago when some of her journal writings were published. People were shocked to hear that she had times, months at a time, when she wasn't sure God was out there. But she kept doing her ministry. We're not going to, if you have always felt good and on fire from God, great. But there's going to be times we don't feel that way, and we just get through it. I think about when my mother died 3 years, almost 4 years ago now, since we're in 2013, of cancer. After 10 years with emphysema, and the last 6 weeks with lung cancer that they didn't catch early enough because of the emphysema. And as she's in ICU the final days on a ventilator, I was ordained a priest 2 years at that point, feeling like I ought to say some great prayers. But I just said, God, I know I'm supposed to be praying right now. Don't really feel like praying, so my prayer is just take care of her. And within a few days, she died. But that, to me, wasn't God not taking care of her. God did take care of her. She'd had emphysema for 10 years. Other things in her life made her life fairly miserable in some ways and that. And he set her free from all that. But, we don't always have the moments of being on fire. It'd be wonderful if we did. But in the down times, God is there too, even if we don't realize it. So with that, we'll turn and I'll open the floor to any questions.
Whatever happened, how did your mom react when you told her you were going to go to seminary?
Good question. And I was actually both of my parents, I was kind of nervous about telling them. When my mother hadn't gone to church in years, she knew I had gone back to church and seemed happy I was going back to church, but didn't ever show much interest in herself going back to church. So I kind of wondered, because I was the good son who was regularly at her house and doing stuff for her, and going to seminary means I wouldn't be able to do all those things for her while I was away at school. And she was very happy. And it's some ways very encouraging, not necessarily a lot because of the fact she wasn't going to church herself. And all of my time through seminary, after I was ordained, she never went to church. But she would make comments, I'm glad you're doing this. I'm glad you're doing this. Although there's some people that there used to be a tradition that if your son became a priest, the mom was guaranteed to get to heaven. So she may have heard that tradition. But was supportive. And actually my dad, because my dad was not Catholic, I was trying to figure out how to tell him. One day I'm at his house, and he was remarried at that point. And I'm thinking, how am I going to tell him? I'm thinking about doing this. How am I going to tell him? In fact, and he knew I was involved in church. And he says, so are you thinking about becoming a priest? Boy, that makes this conversation a lot easier. And he was very supportive too.
Can you say the Mass in Latin?
No.
I didn't.
He asked if I could say the Mass in Latin. In seminary, we took one class in Latin, and one day I was reading a sentence of in Latin out loud for the class, and the teacher, who was a priest's comment was, it was a good thing we didn't say Mass in Latin because the people of God wouldn't know what I was saying. I said, that's okay, I don't know what I'm saying.
So Father, as being there and having done that, what would you advise the rest of us that have family members that may be estranged from the church? What kind of approach should we take with them?
Don't be too pushy, but encourage. And some of it starts as simple, like if you're planning your Christmas celebrations for your family, one thing I tell people, and the family says, oh, we want to do Christmas on Christmas Eve at 5 o'clock, and you want to go to the 4 o'clock Mass or the 6:30, so you can't be there at 5 o'clock. Don't rearrange your schedule for them. Tell them they need, church is important. And say, if you want to go with me, you can go. If you don't, you don't. It's your choice, but it's important to me. So I think that's the biggest thing, is to let them know it's important to you. Because I did have one aunt that once in a great while on the Catholic side would make comments about me going to church. And I actually on the Protestant side, I had one aunt that would also make comments, so she was thinking I would go to the Protestant church as opposed to the Catholic church. But just those nudges, when you have opportunities to say something, to say that it's important to you, not to force it on them, but say, this means something to me. I'm going to make it a part. Certainly at Christmas time, but other times too. I know people who will tell me they end up missing a Mass because they're traveling to some family event out of town, and their children make all the travel arrangements for them, and the travel arrangements don't work for making Mass. I'm like, okay, this time, next time, don't let them do that. Say, I want to be able to get, when I travel, I still want to be able to get to Mass. If you're in Utah in a small town, you may have a problem. But, and we're talking about, you're going to Detroit, you ought to be able to have not too much trouble finding it. So to let them know it's important that way. And if they ask, say, well, why is this so important to you? Say something to them. Some people will say, I don't know what to say to them. I don't know what to talk about in that. And that's true. Sometimes I still wonder when people ask me, what particular do you say? And I say, you don't need to talk doctrine at that time. I have a master's degree in divinity. Master's of divinity degree in theology. You don't need, the people, especially when they're away from church, the best thing you can be telling them about is what makes you want to come to church. Not all the teachings of the church, but if you had certain moments in your life, or people that say they survived an accident they knew they couldn't have survived unless God was involved, or little things, whatever it might be, to tell people what that means, why it's important to you. Don't just say it's important. I mean, you might just start, but if they ask more, say, this is why it's important to me. Sometimes if we're cradle Catholics, it's tough because sometimes it really does seem at times in our lives, I go to church every Sunday because that's what I've always done. But, if there's anything more, to be telling them about that. Other questions?
You told us that you went through confession when you came back, and you had 5 minutes and the priest had 35. Can you kind of walk us through what that experience might be like for someone that may be considering coming back to the church, what they can expect?
Well, with that, let me take this opportunity to mention, over here on the table, we have 2 different CDs over here. There's one that is the Mass Explained by Father Larry Richards, I believe is that one. There's 100 of them, so there's lots of them. There's another one by Scott Hahn that's on the healing power of confession. And he talks about, and for those who don't know who Scott Hahn is,
EWTN. EWTN.
He's on the EWTN. He works at Franciscan University in Steubenville, Ohio. He was a Presbyterian minister, and when he was a Presbyterian minister for a while, he thought the Catholic Church had it all wrong. He is now a Catholic theologian. and is a very popular speaker on Catholic stuff. Very good, very easy to understand. That CD is on the healing power of confession. There's 50 of them. I think there's more than 50 people. Oh, by the way, did the ushers count the people? Did you take up the collection? But the CDs this time are free. Feel free to take one. And Scott Hahn is actually by Lighthouse Media, and they actually have other ones we get. If people are interested, we may talk about having more of them in church. But it talks about the value of confession. But if you go back, and the first time I went to confession coming back, I went on a Saturday night, but I was in there for 40 minutes. Fortunately, I don't think there's anybody else in line. You can call and make an appointment. And this isn't just if you've been away from the church. Some people just haven't gone to confession in a number of years. If you feel like you got something to talk about and it's been a number of years, you can call in and make an appointment. Oh, but Father, I couldn't go face to face. You can call, make it with me. I don't know if every priest will do this. You can call, make an appointment, say you want to remain anonymous. I will if we say we're going to meet at 3 o'clock, I will be in church before 3 o'clock, get behind the screen, so when you come walking in, I don't know who you are. Although I will say, my first time back, I went face to face, and I've almost always gone face to face, and I like going face to face. But you can, there's a confessional here. You have both the option of sitting in a chair face to face with a priest, or kneeling at the kneeler with a screen so I can't see who you are. But you go, and you come, and if you haven't gone in a number of years, just start by saying, Father, this is the first time I've been in confession in 15 years. I'm not sure what to do, and I will help walk you through it. We'll probably start with a prayer at that point, and then I'll say, if you haven't already said exactly how long it's been, when I say exactly, I'm not talking days, I'm talking 10 years versus 15 years. How long has it been since your last confession? What do you think you've done wrong? Like, you rattle off whatever you've done, and then, if it feels like you've probably included most things, then we may just start talking about this. Ideally, when you go to confession, if say you go every couple months, you would say, I did this 3 times. If you haven't gone in 20 years, you're probably not going to know how many times you did something. And I'm not sure we have the time for you to recollect them all. But I tell people in that case, let me know, did you do it a lot or little? Did you do it last week, or did you do it 20 years ago? And you haven't done it in the last 15. I might ask questions about, and I do this part even if you go to confession weekly, maybe something along the lines, why do you think you did that? It's not to pry. The idea of confess that is to try and offer you some advice, to get you to think about, because when we come to confession, we're supposed to want to change our behavior. And often we think of, this is the sin I'm doing. But if we want to change that, why are we doing it? We got to know why we're doing it to change it. So when I ask questions in the confessional, it's not because I'm being nosy or I'm curious about something. It's to help the person. I mean, if I felt like I asked a question, that's odd. I've asked questions in the confessional along these lines that I don't want to ask because I don't want to know the answer. And sometimes I say, don't answer this question, but have you thought about? But that's the whole point of that, is why are you doing this? What's it going to take to change? And when I give penances, in the early church, penances could take months or years. Somewhere along the line, we got to Hail Marys and Our Fathers. I might tell someone to pray a decade of the Rosary. But I'll say, like, as you pray the X number of Hail Marys, ask for help to find patience like Mary, or ask for help to have pure thoughts, and that. It's all geared to help us to do better with that. And people come in and not knowing that you're supposed to say an act of contrition. If they don't know an act of contrition, I say, repeat after me. And by the way, when I'm in the confessional, I can never remember the act of contrition. In our confessional, I now have books that have the act of contrition in them, both on my side and on the kneeler. sign. But it's meant, I do not want it to be threatening. But again, if you haven't gone a number of years, I might suggest you make an appointment. I would still do that appointment for you in a way to remain confidential if you want, so I don't know who you are, because I know that does make a difference for some people. Other questions? Corey?
I have always wondered, and I'm so glad that you mentioned it, I always wondered if priests could feel something during the consecration. I wondered if you could say more about that, or is it something that you can't really describe?
They can't really describe. I mean, if I could, I would do more. Or it's just an awareness, that something more is going on here. I've actually read stories in books of years long past of a priest or two when they were saying Mass and kind of having a vision as they're holding their hands over, they just look down and they swear they see a baby, the baby Jesus there. Mine's nothing like, it's just a sense that, God is working through what I'm saying. Somebody over here?
How do you recommend that we advise friends who are going through a dry spell in their faith journey and they question, where's God and what should we do? And why isn't God listening to my prayers? And why is this happening to me? What would you say to a friend who's going through that?
Friends with dry spells. Well, one, depending on the friend and nature of conversation, one of the things I've referred to with people that do that is the Mother Teresa example. That even these people that we put so high on a pedestal have those dry spells too. And to be talking to people about, honestly, I have a spiritual director who happens to be a priest. A spiritual director does not need to be a priest, but as a priest, I think it's a little more important for it to be a priest. And sometimes the things I talk to him, I say to him, I'm in a dry spell. I'm ordained 5 years and I'm in a dry spell. What do I do? But we can't, to say, some of that is natural and okay, and one of the things I've been talking about with my spiritual director is I've been praying the same way for years, for my private prayers. Maybe it's time to try something different. And that, and with the dry spells, to examine, do they know when it started? Was there an event that started it? Is it just happened? And what do they do? I mean, some people say, Father, I don't really feel the presence of God at all, or I feel this dryness. How much do you pray? Well, I come to Mass on Sunday. Maybe the first thing you need to do is pray a little bit more, which may mean then talking to somebody to get ideas of ways to pray during the week, because some people really, how do we pray? And with that, actually, the other thing I've had, some people will pray a lot. People will say countless rosaries, and if the rosary works for you, good. But sometimes with prayer, we just repeat a lot of words. Sometimes as we're repeating those words, or we need to have quiet time to listen, to give God a chance to say something. To me, prayer ultimately is about conversation. And conversation is supposed to be a dialogue. Give God a chance to speak. And it's not that God's going to say, now look here, here's what I want you to do. I keep asking God to send me daily emails. He does not do it. But all these things is there something different we can do? Or with a dryness, again, maybe it's a person who prays a lot, but the prayer just feels like mechanics. I will say, despite the fact I'm a priest, I do not pray the rosary daily. Right now I'm kind of in a mode of doing it once a week. If I pray the rosary every day, for me, it just becomes repetition. For some people, that's the best form of prayer. I know there's people after daily Mass, there's people before 8:30 Mass on Sunday that will pray the rosary. If it works for you, good, the church encourages us to do it. But if I do it every day, it just becomes repetition. Different things work for different people. We can't all pray exactly the same. Certainly we pray the Mass in common. But even that can be, someone who say, well, this is my favorite part of Mass, or this is my favorite part of Mass, or I like it when they sing the music this way, or I like it when they sing it this way. There's differences to find what works for us. But when I say what works for us, not what makes us feel all warm and fuzzy, but what brings us closer to God. It's not about what's just warm and fuzzy. I know I've heard of people in independent Protestant churches when the pastor changes, the whole congregation moves to another church. If you don't like the new priest, you just move on type of mentality. That we have to see something beyond that. Kim?
Has your spiritual journey influenced your brother?
Well, first off, I was confirmed with one of my brothers. I actually have two brothers.
Okay.
The younger one was too young to be confirmed at the time, and never did get confirmed. And actually probably has no idea he's actually Catholic. Well, he was baptized when he was like 1 year old, so he doesn't remember that. And he actually made his first communion, but then after that, wasn't going to church. With both my brothers, as my younger brother literally may not realize he would technically be Catholic because he's baptized Catholic. He went to church some with my dad's family when he was 9, 10 years old. So he might identify himself as Baptist. As far as I know, other than my ordinations and my first masses, he hasn't been in church. And he just turned 40, so in 25 years probably or more. The older brother, I think sometimes I wonder if he has issues with the church. Although it was strange, I was in seminary and he emails me, it was Lent, and he says, "Do I really have to eat fish on Fridays in Lent?" And I'm thinking, why are you asking? You don't go to church. But I didn't say that to him because I wanted to encourage him to do what the church said. But as far as I don't know if he's been to church at all. He had, because of his work schedule, he didn't make my ordination.
Do you see much of him?
I see my brothers a couple of times a year.
Oh.
And that, so they have not caught the fire from me. But my brothers and I are very different people in that respect. So we have different. Not that I wouldn't hope that they would return to church, but the things that would draw me in wouldn't necessarily. We would probably look for different styles churches if we were all.
Did you ever have thoughts of doing other than diocesan priesthood work, missionary work, teaching work, becoming a Jesuit? I mean, do they help you solve
There
that
could be
problem?
some jokes about Jesuits in there someplace, but we won't make them count. Missionary, basically it was always mainly diocesan, but a large part of that is because most of my family was in the area. Now they are, since I entered seminary, they are a little more spread out. But it's like all my family's in the area, I want us to hear it. I have never felt a call, at least on a long-term basis, to go to a foreign land and spend years there. When the earthquake happened in Haiti, I actually wondered a little bit about going down there for a short period, but it would not have been an extended thing. Religious orders, as I was thinking about priesthood, just didn't know that much about them, the one exception, because we had the retired Franciscan in the parish. I did think about that a little bit, but the Franciscans basically don't have a presence in the diocese because I wanted to stay in the area. I wouldn't have been able to do that if I become So it's more family that I didn't think about the others. Although I think it also involves God's call for me. If God really wanted me to become a Jesuit or a Franciscan, he could have got me to do that. But my human thoughts never went that way. Three quarters, or half of it, say, is geography, and half of it is not knowing about the religious orders. Because at the point when I entered seminary, the only religious order priest I ever had met was the Franciscan.
When you talked about your thinking like an engineer, how does that affect how you are approaching being a pastor here?
The diocese sent me to a parish that needs building repairs. Well, and some of it would relate to engineering, some of it is just my personality, period. But I tend to be an organization person. I do know some engineers who are not organized people. But I tend to collect information, kind of want to get all the facts together and do that. And it's probably the one thing that's keeping me patient right now versus wanting to fix everything. And not that there's a lot of stuff that needs to be, it's not that there's all kinds of things wrong with the parish, but it's just, where do we go from here? I mean, like with the evangelization team, who are, who worked with me on this presentation, that what can we do better at in the parish? Reaching out to people who don't come to church and that. To take some time to learn it, collect the data, put the data together. Not that engineers are the only ones that do that, but the way I've been working through that in my mind is engineering for me. And the engineers in the room should think that's a wonderful thing. Others?
As someone who came to the priesthood after a bit of a career and stuff, why, do you have any thoughts about why there's so few men are drawn to the priesthood these days, or even women to consecrated lives?
Well, I think a big part of it in our society today, if you become a priest, you become a religious, you cannot be married. And not that there's people now who live together for years and years and never intend to get married. But there's still, people used to be the celibacy was seen as something special. Now it's almost seen like, especially I think, and amplified by the sex abuse scandal, not caused by it, but amplified by it. People see it as strange not to marry. Some of it I literally believe is, and years ago when people had big families, and if one son or became a priest or a daughter became religious, you still had others to have grandchildren. I've actually heard people that only have 1 or 2 kids say, I don't want my children to become priest or religious because I want to have grandchildren. I know of some guys that I was in seminary with that they said their parents actually discouraged them from becoming priests for that type of reason. And used to be priests were considered being a step up in society. In some ways, that was bad because it was clericalism. The priests were special and holier than thou. Priests are not holier than thou. Hopefully, we're on the right track, but that. And without seeing that specialness, though, it just becomes, people are less inspired to do it, and especially balanced against like the idea, okay, if I become a priest or a religious, I can't get married. That's the con, what's the pro? And you don't see that pro so much in society today. I think the biggest thing that would change the number of priests or religious, if we just plain had more people coming to church, then more people would become priest or religious as a follow-through. Not that 10% of people became priests, but if you got 200 going to church and 10% of them become priests, that's 20, which it's nowhere near that percentage. But if you take that same 10% and you got 2,000 going to church, that's 200. So just more people going to church, and there is fewer and few people going to church. So, Justin, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was curious, do the people that inspired or influenced you when you were discerning your vocation, do they all know about how they did that in your life? Or were there some people that maybe didn't know how they influenced you?
Well, like the pastor of the home parish knows his involvement, or knew his involvement. He passed away a number of years ago. The guy that told me about the dream, we had conversations later on that he knew it. Does everybody know? I don't know. But the ones that had an ongoing role in it, I think no. If someone did a one-time thing, they don't necessarily. No. But I talk about my story, and I've gone back to people. I told some people, I said, I'm glad you said this. That was a big deal. Any other questions?
I think we're happy to have you here.
Remember the CDs, and on all the tables, there's the booklets. It's just, the booklet in front of you tonight, if you were here at Christmas or weekend after, is the exact same booklet we gave out at Christmas. When at Christmas, we made sure we had lots of them, so we still have them. So if you haven't seen it before, feel free to take it. If you've seen it before but know somebody else who might want to see it, and I say, if the videotape or the audio recording of this turns out, hopefully we'll be able to get it on the website if you know people who want to see it.